You know how sometimes you don't realize you're in deep trouble until you're almost drowning in it? That's how I felt when I first tried to break up with Emily. It wasn't as if we had a big explosive fight or anything. Actually, it was the lack of anything at all that led me to that point. I had reached a place where I felt completely drained, like I was just walking through life with 1,000 pounds on my back, and I couldn't pinpoint why. It all started about 2 years ago. I met Emily at a party thrown by a friend, someone I barely knew. I'll admit it, I was charmed from the moment I saw her. She was standing alone in a corner of the backyard, wearing an oversized sweater and sipping on a can of soda, her eyes darting around like she was out of her element. There was something so vulnerable and out of place about her that I felt the urge to talk to her. I didn't think it would go anywhere. I just wanted to make her feel a little less alone. When I approached her, she flashed this half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I learned that she had come to the party with a coworker who had promptly disappeared. We chatted, mostly small talk about our jobs. I worked at an architecture firm, and she worked in retail. By the end of the night, we exchanged numbers, and I felt a connection there, even though it was subtle. We started seeing each other more frequently after that. Emily was always quiet but observant, and she seemed genuinely interested in my work. She had this way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the world. Her eyes locked onto yours, and she would nod with genuine interest, as if my ramblings about city zoning regulations were the most fascinating stories she'd ever heard. Things moved quickly after that, too quickly. A few months in, she confessed that she didn't have many friends or family. Her parents had passed away in a car crash when she was young, and she'd been raised by an aunt who wasn't particularly warm or caring. She'd always been a loner, always struggled to fit in, and that's why she was so grateful to have me. The way she said it tugged at my heart. She made me feel like I was her world. Before I knew it, Emily was practically living in my apartment. I didn't mind at first. It was nice coming home to someone. She'd always be there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face lighting up when she saw me. The place that used to feel empty and sterile felt warm, and I liked that. But then, over time, something shifted. At first, it was just little things. Emily lost her job, which wasn't really her fault. The store she worked at closed down. I told her it was fine. She could take some time to figure things out, and I'd cover the rent. But weeks turned into months, and Emily never looked for another job. She just stayed home all day, scrolling through TikTok or binge-watching TV shows, while I worked long hours to keep us afloat. I kept telling myself that she was just in a rough patch, that she'd bounce back eventually. But she didn't. She started depending on me for everything, not just financially, but emotionally. She would call me at work, crying over some video she saw, or because the Wi-Fi had cut out for a few minutes. She'd get upset if I wanted to go out with friends, and eventually, I just stopped going. It was easier to just stay home. Emily had no one but me, and that weight was starting to suffocate me. It all came to a head one night when I came home late after a particularly brutal day at work. My boss had been on my case about a project that was running behind, and I'd missed lunch, working straight through the day. I was exhausted and starving, and when I walked through the door, I found Emily in the same spot she always was, curled up on the couch, staring at her phone. "Hey," I said, trying to muster up some enthusiasm. "What's for dinner?" Emily glanced up, her eyes unfocused for a moment before she blinked. "Oh, I didn't make anything. I wasn't sure when you'd be home." I felt something snap inside me. It was a small thing, but it was like the last straw. I dropped my bag on the floor and just stood there, staring at her. "Emily, you're here all day. You couldn't even order takeout or something?" Her face crumpled, and she immediately started to cry. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. I didn't know what you wanted, and I didn't want to mess it up." And that was the thing. She always did this. Every time I tried to bring up anything, she'd break down, and I'd end up comforting her instead. But that night, I couldn't do it. I was too tired, too frustrated, and I just couldn't. "Emily, I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't keep taking care of you like this. I think we need to break up." She froze, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. For a second, I thought she was going to scream or throw something at me, but instead, she just collapsed. She sank to the floor, her body folding in on itself as she started to wail. It was this guttural, heart-wrenching sound that echoed through the apartment, and I just stood there, not knowing what to do. "Please, no!" she sobbed, clutching at my legs. "Please, don't leave me. I have no one else. I'll do better. I promise. Just, please." I wanted to help her, to comfort her, but I couldn't keep living like this. I knelt down and tried to pull her hands away from my legs, but she clung to me like her life depended on it. I ended up spending the rest of the night sitting on the floor with her, trying to calm her down, telling her over and over that it was going to be okay, even though I didn't believe it. Eventually, she cried herself to sleep, her head resting in my lap. I sat there, staring at the wall, feeling like the worst person in the world. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, but I also didn't know how to leave. She had no one, and the thought of her being alone, of her breaking down like this with no one to help her, tore me apart. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, barely able to focus. Emily acted like nothing had happened, like we hadn't had that conversation. She was overly affectionate, constantly trying to cuddle with me or make small talk, but there was a desperation in her eyes that made my stomach twist. I knew I had to end it, but I didn't know how. Every time I tried to bring it up, she'd start to cry, and I'd back down. It was like being trapped in quicksand. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank. Then, something unexpected happened. I came home one evening to find Emily in the kitchen, cooking dinner. She had this nervous smile on her face as she plated up some pasta and handed it to me. "I wanted to do something nice for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was surprised and a little touched. Maybe she was really trying. Maybe we could make this work after all. I sat down at the table, and she joined me, watching me expectantly as I took a bite. It was good. Simple, but good. I smiled at her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could get better. But as the days went on, I noticed something strange. Emily was different. She was still clingy, still needy, but there was an edge to her now. She'd get this look in her eyes sometimes, this calculating look that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She started asking me weird questions about my coworkers, about my friends. She wanted to know where I was all the time, who I was with. At first, I thought it was just her insecurity, but then I started noticing other things. My phone would be moved from where I left it. My laptop, too. One night, I woke up to find her standing over me, just staring at me. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she couldn't sleep and wanted to make sure I was okay. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Then, one day at work, my boss called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be having this conversation. He told me that someone had called the office claiming to be a client and had asked a lot of personal questions about me. The receptionist had found it odd and had reported it to him. My blood ran cold. I knew it had to be Emily. That night, I confronted her. I asked her if she had called my office, and at first, she denied it. But when I pressed her, her face twisted into this ugly sneer and she admitted it. She said she had to know what I was up to, that she couldn't trust me because I was trying to leave her. I was stunned. I didn't even know what to say. I told her that this was it, that we were done, and she just laughed. It was this hollow, bitter laugh that sent chills down my spine. "You think you can just leave me?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk away after everything I've done for you?" I didn't know what she meant by that, but I didn't stick around to find out. I packed a bag and left that night, crashing on a friend's couch. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages from Emily. They started off pleading, begging me to come back, but then they turned angry, threatening. She said she'd ruin my life, that I'd regret ever leaving her. I blocked her number, but it didn't stop. She made fake accounts on social media, sending me messages, posting things about me. She contacted my friends, my coworkers, telling them lies about me. It was like she was everywhere, and I couldn't escape her. I ended up having to change my number, delete my social media, and even move to a new apartment. It was like I was erasing myself just to get away from her. Months went by, and slowly, things started to get better. I got a new place, a small one-bedroom that felt safe and quiet. I started seeing my friends again, reconnecting with the people I'd pushed away when I was with Emily. Life was starting to feel normal again, but then, one day, I got a package in the mail. There was no return address, but when I opened it, I found a single item inside, a framed photo of Emily and me, taken at a fair we'd gone to early in our relationship. Her face was smiling, but her eyes looked empty, almost hollow. There was a note attached to the back. "You can't run from me?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't know how she'd found me, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. That's when I decided that I had to do something. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. I needed to put an end to this, once and for all. I started gathering information, reaching out to people who might know something about her. It wasn't easy. Emily had always been a ghost, with no family and few friends. But eventually, I found someone who knew her, an old coworker from her retail job. She told me that Emily had always been a little off. She'd been fired, not because the store had closed, but because she'd been caught stealing from the register. She'd always had this strange obsession with her coworkers, getting too close, asking too many personal questions. The more I learned, the more I realized that Emily wasn't just clingy. She was dangerous. She had a pattern, a history of latching on to people and refusing to let go. I knew that if I wanted to get her out of my life, I needed to be smart about it. I ended up hiring a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I didn't know what else to do. The investigator managed to dig up more information about her. She'd been in and out of different jobs, different relationships, always leaving a trail of chaos behind her. She had a criminal record, mostly petty stuff, shoplifting, trespassing, but it painted a picture of someone who had no regard for boundaries or the law. With the investigator's help, I was able to get a restraining order against her. It wasn't easy. Emily fought it, showed up in court looking fragile and innocent, crying to the judge about how I was trying to ruin her life. But the evidence was on my side, and eventually the judge granted the order. For a while, things were quiet. I didn't hear from her, didn't see any signs of her. I started to relax, started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was really over. Then one night, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart sank, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The apartment had been trashed, furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, my belongings scattered everywhere. And in the middle of it all, on the floor, was another photo of Emily and me, this one torn in half. I knew in that moment that she wasn't going to stop. The restraining order meant nothing to her. She was going to keep coming after me, no matter what. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of my life, and I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep playing defense. I needed to take control, to show her that I wasn't afraid anymore. I started documenting everything, every message, every call, every time I saw her near my building. I went to the police, filed reports, made sure there was a paper trail. I wanted there to be no doubt about who she was and what she was doing. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I went to her. I found out where she was staying, a rundown motel on the edge of town. I waited until I knew she'd be there, and then I knocked on the door. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I knew I had to face her. She opened the door, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. Then, a slow smile spread across her face, and she stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice soft and sweet, like this was all just some misunderstanding. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken threat hanging between us. "This has to stop, Emily," I said, my voice steady. "You need to leave me alone. If you don't, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life behind bars." Her smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow, forced. "You don't mean that," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I do," I said, taking a step closer. "I have everything, Emily. Every message, every threat. The police know, the court knows. If you come near me again, I'll make sure you never see the light of day." For a moment, she just stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide. Then, slowly, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'll stop. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't let myself hesitate. I got in my car and drove away, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. It's been 6 months now, and I haven't heard from Emily. I moved again, changed my number, and started fresh. I know she's still out there, and maybe she'll try again someday, but I'm not afraid anymore. I took my life back, and I won't let her take it from me again.